Peace and blessings, dear comrades and friends. This is the first videos in a series that will be discussing volume 1 of Marx's magnum opus Capital. So this is actually part of a project where we try to read the book collectively. We believe that comrades from different backgrounds, from different educational backgrounds, different experiences, different continents, different countries that are all capitalist, that all these people have something to contribute, so we can really look at the book but also look at today's capitalist society from different angles. I really hope, inshallah, that this project will help us get through capital, because I know quite a lot of comrades, quite a lot of communists, socialists who have started reading this book. So the Capital by Marx. This is my copy, which is actually in Dutch. That's my native language. They got through the first section, maybe the first few sections, the first few chapters, maybe, but they stopped somewhere, because actually, especially the beginning of the book is quite dry economical theory. So you have to get through a couple of hundreds of pages of dry economic theory before you get to the more juicy parts, the parts about the history of capitalism, politics of capitalism, the parts that actually expose capitalism as the criminal system that it is. We're trying with this group to read one section, or more or less one section every week, depending on how long and complicated the section is. And you can read it on paper, like I do. You can also just go to marxists.org. I will put the link in the description down below, where they have the complete book in many different languages. Many people think, many schools and universities teach that Marx was some kind of a naive economist who didn't really understand economy, that he was quite unaware of the big bourgeois theories of his day, the theory of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and so on, that we shouldn't really put too much time and effort in reading him, because actually today we know better, and bourgeois economy is the scientific economy, while Marx is actually just let us say, a naive, almost hippie-like, and quite cynical way of looking at capitalism. Well, this isn't true at all. Marx has studied thoroughly all the bourgeois economists of his day. He's constantly quoting them throughout the book. We will also see that. But he's not just learning from them. He's not just learning and using their theories. He's actually expanding on them. He's trying to answer those questions that they choose to ignore. He's trying to see how their theories, their bourgeois economist theories, actually explain what is wrong with capitalism, how their ideas explain things like poverty, exploitation, oppression, and so on. Without further ado, we might better start diving into the first section, which is all about commodities. Now, what is the basic unit of the capitalist economy? And I think that instinctively many people, especially people on the left, would say, well, it's capital, it's wealth, it's money, that is the most important thing. Well, Marx tried to look at it on a more basic level. What is wealth? What is it composed of? And then he says that the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. So all the wealth of our societies, our capitalist societies, is actually made up of commodities. Now, in order to understand that, it might be good to really try and understand what a commodity is. What makes something a commodity? and what is the nature of commodities, what makes them so important that they are really the basic building bricks of all the wealth in all the capitalist societies. Well, very simply put, a commodity is a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants. And Marx immediately notes that this is not just the wants of the stomach. This is not just something you materially need. It's something you want. It could be something that you want for aesthetic reasons, something that you want because it's a status symbol. There are so many reasons why we might want or need something, but this isn't important. The only thing is important is that a commodity is something we want, something we need. Because if we want it, if we need it, we will be prepared to exchange it for another commodity. Now, if we see that, there are actually two ways of looking at this. There's the fact that we want it, that we need it, that it satisfies some of our needs. And that's a qualitative aspect. But we want it and need it. That's why we are prepared to exchange it for something else. That's actually a quantitative aspect. And if we look at this, we see that the quality, and Marx uses the term use value, the utility of a thing makes it a use value. The shoe, by its very nature, is use value because we can use it to protect our feet. Food, by its nature, is use value because we can metabolize it. It gives us energy, and if we don't eat, we die. That's a very important thing. Try to remember that throughout the book. You need food to survive. You need to fill the stomach. Um, what When we look at it from the qualitative point of view, then actually the amount of labor that has been put in a commodity isn't that relevant. Um, it doesn't really matter if you had a good meal, if you had a satisfying meal. It doesn't really matter if a whole team of people have been working on it for days and days, or if you just fixed something in the kitchen. If it has the same use value, if it satisfies your needs in the same way, then the amount of labor isn't really that relevant. Um, and this use value only becomes a reality by its use, by the consumption of it. If you buy food and you put it on a shelf for days, for weeks, for months, for years, at a certain point it will be spoiled and you will have to throw it away. So at that point, the food wasn't a use value anymore. It's only if you consume it, if you use it, um, that makes it a use value. That's the qualitative aspect of a commodity. Now, the quantitative aspect, commodity is also an exchange value, or simply put, value. So every time that Marx only uses the term value, he's speaking of the exchange value of a commodity. And this is a quantitative relation. It's the proportion in which one sort of use values, in which one sort of commodities can be exchanged for another sort. Um, we'll look at an example. Well, first of all, value is something that is constantly changing. The value of a book now or 200 years ago, the value of a pair of trousers, the value of a plate of food, all these things are actually changing, constantly changing through history, through the different societies. So it appears to be something accidental, coincidental, something purely relative. Actually, bourgeois economy will say that it is something that is quite accidental. It arises from the very game of supply and demand. It's something that arises from human relations and human whims at the market. An intrinsic value, something that is really in the commodity itself, and that builds its exchange value. It seems to be a contradiction in terms. Oh, if you look at it, if you take any commodity and you try to look at it on a molecular level, on the atomic level, and you will never find, okay, this is the exchange value. This is something fixed in the material form of the commodity that gives it its value. Marx uses an example to illustrate this, and he says that, for example, 1 quarter of wheat, and a quarter is just an old unit of measurement. We could also say 1 kilogram of wheat. 1 quarter of wheat can actually be exchanged for X units of shoe polish on the market, or for Y meters of silk, or for Z grams of gold. So each of the other commodities it can be exchanged for in a certain quantitative relation. Um, and since all these commodities can be exchanged for the value of 1 quarter of wheat, they must all be replaceable or equal to each other in some sense. There must be something they have in common. There must be something in all these commodities that makes them, in this quantitative relationship, equal to 1 quarter of wheat. So Marx actually concludes from this, has two conclusions from this. First of all, the exchange values of a commodity, they express something that is equal in all of these commodities. And secondly, the exchange value is only the form of something that is contained in it, but it's distinguishable from it. So the exchange value is not really that which they all have in common. It's just the form that this thing, this something they have in common, takes once you're in a market situation exchanging one commodity for another. The proportion in which two commodities are exchangeable can be represented by an equation. And I know that some people right now are scared. Many people believe that equations are some kind of uh, almost magical formulas that common people really can't grasp. It's a kind of secret language between scientists, and it's there to make things more obscure, to make things less understandable. Well, the opposite is true. An equation, a good equation, if you understand the language that it's expressed in, and actually the language that Marx uses here, as we will see, is very simple. If you understand its language, then the equation is a very good visual representation of a relationship that is important. So the proportion of exchange between two commodities can be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of one commodity is equated to some quantity of the other. For example, once again, this 1 quarter of wheat equals X units of shoe polish. It doesn't mean that if you have 1 quarter of wheat and X units of shoe polish on the table, that you cannot distinguish between them and that, oh, they're the same. No. It actually means they have something in common, something that makes them equal on a certain level in a market when we want to exchange one for the other. So this tells us that in two different things there must exist something in equal quantities, something that is common to both. They have something in common. It's just not really quite sure yet what it is. So these two things must be in some way equal to a third, which is neither the one nor the other. So there must be something that makes this equation work, that makes that 1 quarter of wheat in some respect is equal to X units of shoe polish. And the exchange value of each of them must be reducible to this third. And actually, the exchange value of both of them is no other than the form that this third, this something in common, this something that is both present in the wheat and the shoe polish, the form that it takes on the market. So, what is it? What is it that they have in common? What is this natural basis, this natural source of their exchange value? Well, Marx says it cannot be geometrical. Triangular commodities aren't intrinsically worth more or less than round commodities. It cannot be something chemical, because the chemical makeup of something isn't really what makes it intrinsically worth more or less on the market. It cannot be their weight. It cannot be their size. It cannot be their color. So all these things, um, all these natural properties of commodities are not what makes them, what gives them their exchange value. Actually, all these properties can be quite important for these commodities as use values. If you want to wear a shoe, it better be the right shape, it better be the right size, it better not be too heavy. If you want to eat food, well, let's hope it has a chemical composition that's suitable for your metabolism. But as an exchange value, to know what really makes X quantities or X kilograms of this equal Y meters of the other commodity, um, all these natural properties, they don't really seem to be the source of these quantitative relationships. So if we want to exchange these values, if we want to know the exchange value of commodity, then we have to make complete abstraction of all these properties, of their use value, of that which makes them different to other commodities. Now, here Marx quotes Nicholas Bourbon, a 17th century British economist, a bourgeois economist, um, just the first of so many that he will be quoting throughout the book, who observes, and it's really quite a simple observation, that one sort of wares, one sort of commodities are as good as another if the values be equal. So if they have the equal value, there's no difference or distinction in things of equal value. £100 worth of lead or iron is as great value as £100 worth of silver and gold. Um, Pounds here not being a unit of weight, but a unit of currency, of course. Um, as use values, commodities are of different qualities. So, and they better be, because something that has the best possible qualities to be eaten as bread isn't really good as shoeware, or vice versa. But as exchange values, they're merely different quantities, and consequently, they do not contain an atom of use value, Marx says. So if you go to the markets, really, you don't care too much about the use value of the commodities. All that is really interesting is the quantitative relationship, their exchange value. When we leave out of consideration the use value of commodities, when we make complete abstraction of the use value and all the natural properties that come with it, they only have one common property left, and that is that they're all being products of labor. So that's what's in common with a quarter of wheat, X units of shoe polish, Y meters of silk, or Z grams of gold. If you want to have them, somebody has to put in labor. Somebody has to work to create these, to produce these products. Um, but when we speak of exchange value, we're not interested in the concrete labor. Actually, it doesn't really matter if it was the work of a carpenter or a weaver or a baker. All that really matters is that they are products of labor in some way. If we want to make abstraction from its use value, we also have to make abstraction from the material elements and shapes that make the product a use value. And we have to make abstraction from the concrete material forms of labor that went in it. Its existence as a material thing is put out of sight, Marx writes. So neither can it any longer be regarded as the product of any specific kind of labor. So it's not because it is the work of a tailor, of a carpenter, of a pharmacist. There's nothing left but what is common to them all. And Marx calls this human labor in the abstract. Human beings had to put in an effort. So they're products of human muscles, nerves, brains, of human bodies performing certain things on a material world to transform it and to produce commodities. So here we see the work of a designer, the work of a cleaner, the work of a baker, the work of a weaver, the work of a farmer, a miner. All these different kinds of labor are actually equal to one another in some respect, and they're equal to this abstract human labor. But if this abstract human labor is the thing that is important, and if it is a quantitative aspect of this labor that we are researching, then what is the magnitude, or in what is the magnitude of exchange value to be measured? Um, how can we compare completely different forms of labor with each other? How can we compare the labor of a carpenter with the labor of a farmer, or the labor of a pharmacist with the labor of a tailor? What do they all have in common? By the quantity of value creating labor contained in the commodity, of course. Marx right, but this doesn't really answer the question. So, how do we measure this quantity? Are we going to measure how much force the nerves or the muscles have been using? Are we measuring how much chemical energy the body had to dispose? How are we measuring the amount of electronical impulses in our brain? What are we going to measure to compare these completely different forms of labor? Well, the quantity of labor is measured by its duration. The only thing that really is left when we make abstraction of all these specific things of labor is that you have to to work for a certain amount of time, measured in weeks, in days, in hours. And that is what all these products have in common: a certain amount of labor, a certain time of work, of working is crystallized in them, as Marx puts it. Now, this of course doesn't mean that commodities that are produced by an idle and unskillful worker, by somebody who is a bit lazy, by somebody who doesn't really do the job too well, that this work would be more valuable because they require more time to produce. That would be absurd. If, for example, I am a carpenter and I produce tables, but being quite unskillful and idle as I am, I need twice as much time to produce one table as my neighbor who's also a carpenter. It doesn't mean that my tables are worth the double than his. The labor that forms the substance of value, the labor that creates exchange value, is homogeneous human labor. It's expenditure of one uniform labor power. It is the average amount of labor required for producing a certain commodity, um, no more and no less than is socially necessary. So, by socially necessary, Marx means necessary given the certain circumstances of a society, of a level of technology, of a level of scientific understanding, of a level of production of labor. The labor time socially necessary is that required to produce an article under the normal conditions of production and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. If we just think about the amount of labor time that is needed to produce an article of clothing today in a factory, and compare that to the amount of labor time that was needed 200 years ago at the beginning of capitalism, by tailors and weavers who worked by hand, then you will see that the amount of socially necessary, the average amount of labor required for producing the commodity is far less these days than it was 200 years ago. The same goes for food, the same goes for technology. Many, as our technological forms of producing, our industrialization of our production has changed, has increased the productivity over the last centuries, the average value of the commodities produced in this system have also dropped. Um, this is all quite abstract, and here Marx gives an example. Also, an example that is actually quite good at seeing the difference between this labor theory of exchange value and one of the more popularized bourgeois theories that we'll speak about in a few minutes. And Marx gives the example of diamonds. Diamonds are very rare. There are only a few of them in the crust of the earth. You need to put in a great deal of labor to find them, to discover them, and then to mine them. Um, so there's a whole lot of labor that is represented in just one diamond, that is crystallized in just one diamond. And for example, if you look at the complete production of the Brazilian diamond mines in the 80 years before 1823, um, this complete diamond production of 80 years hasn't really realized the exchange value of just 1.5 years of average production on the sugar and coffee plantations of the same country. And even though one diamond, producing one diamond costs much more, immensely more labor than producing coffee or sugar, um, the simple fact that so much more coffee and sugar could be produced, so much more labor went in the total production of coffee and sugar. This makes that the product, the commodity that is that seems to be less valuable, has been the source of far more total value. So if there would be richer mines, if diamonds would be less rare, if it would be far more easier to find, to discover, to mine, then there would be less labor necessary to to produce one diamond, and the value of a diamond would fall. Actually, Marx predicts, Marx thinks about a future, a possible future, and we're living in this future today, where it is possible to take a bunch of carbon atoms, press them together, and create diamonds on an industrial scale. And he predicts that since it will cost, and since today it does cost less labor to produce diamonds in a factory, their value will also fall. In general, the greater the productiveness of labor, the less the labor time is required for the production of an article, of a certain commodity, the less is the amount of labor crystallized in that article, and the less is its value. And vice versa, the less the productiveness of labor, the greater the labor time required for the production of a commodity, the greater is its value. Um, this is the basic idea of the labor theory of value, and it goes directly against one of the ideas that is quite popular in bourgeois economy, where they say, well, it's actually the rarity, the scarcity of a certain commodity that defines its value. And if a product is more scarce, if the supply is lower, then the value will go up. And since there is also demand, people will be prepared to pay more for something that is scarce. And this is what bourgeois economy sees as the source of the exchange value of a product. Marx says no, if a commodity is rare, if it takes lots of effort to find and produce something. It's the amount of labor that goes into producing it that actually defines its higher value. Mm, so there are a few remarks at the end of this section. Um, so a thing can be a use value without actually having a value. Some things can satisfy human needs, human wants, without actually having exchange value. Um, this is the case when its utility to human beings is not due to labor, for example. Um, well, the air that we breathe, the oxygen that we really need. We have to breathe several times a minute just to stay alive, but we don't need any labor to produce this oxygen. It's just there around us in the air. So there's no labor needed. There's no exchange value. A thing can also be useful and a product of labor without actually being a commodity. Um, One example could be the food that we prepare for our own consumption or for the consumption of the people we live together with. Um, it does satisfy a need. I just want to repeat, and please bear in mind, eat some food from time to time. You will need it to survive. So it does really satisfy one of our basic needs. And most people don't really like eating dry rice or uncleaned, uncooked vegetables, unboiled eggs, and all these things. Actually, we like all foods to be prepared. Probably we actually evolved to uh, um, eat prepared food, eat cooked foods. Our metabolism is much more happier with that. So we have to put in a certain amount of labor, but this food is not for exchange. It's just to consume immediately. Another example that Marx gives is that of medieval peasants. Medieval peasants, they had to work on the land of a landlord, and in order to gain the right to work on this land, they were obliged to give a certain percentage of their production as rent to the feudal landlord. They also had to give a certain percentage of their production as tithes to the church. Um, I think it's to gain the right of entrance to heaven or something. I must be clear that I'm not really an expert on this part of Christian economy. I'm a Muslim, and it doesn't really work like that in our religion. But anyway, the rent given to the feudal landlord or the tithes given to the church aren't they are use value. They are produced by labor, but they are not exchange value because they're not exchanged for other commodities. The commodity has to be at the same time use value for others, social use value, um, and it has to be produced to be exchanged for other commodities. It has to be produced for the market. If not, it's not a commodity. Now, the last remark that's quite important and actually quite logical if you think about it. Nothing can have exchange value without being an object of utility. Something that has no use, that has no usefulness, um, will not have an exchange value. You can spend a whole lot of time producing some silly object that nobody needs, nobody wants. Well, then all the labor that you have put into that commodity, to that object, is also useless because nobody will ever want to trade another commodity for it. So if the thing is useless, so is labor contained in it, and no value is created. Um, I think this is more or less the end of the first section, in which Marx tried to define a commodity. Let's just summarize what we've seen. So a commodity is a something that is produced to satisfy the needs or the wants of human beings. And there are two ways to look at it. There's a qualitative way to look at it, and there's a quantitative way to look at it. Um, the qualitative aspect of a commodity is that it is a use value. It's something that can be used to satisfy some material needs, of human beings. The quantitative way to look at it is that it is an exchange value or simply a value. It's something that can be exchanged for other commodities. Qualitatively speaking, a commodity is a concrete, useful product. The material form of the product is relevant. If your shoes have the material form of a loaf of bread, then they're not really that useful. So the material form of the product is relevant and it should be adapted to its use. But as an abstract product, as a quantity, the material form is actually quite irrelevant. You can exchange loaves of bread for shoes, and only the amount of labor that has been put in it is relevant to define how many loaves of bread one pair of shoes would be worth. So only the specific form of productive labor, the specific activities is relevant when we look at the quality, the qualitative aspect of a commodity. The work that a tailor does is important if we want to look at the use value of a pair of trousers. If a tailor does exactly the same work, exactly the same activities as a baker or a miner or a pharmacist, then actually the pair of trousers won't be worth too much. They won't serve our needs. Um, Actually, they won't be trousers even. When we look at it from the quantitative point of view, however, it's only the abstract labor that is relevant, the average necessary labor, and we measure it in the necessary labor time. So, qualitatively speaking, different specific forms of labor can't be compared to one another. Um, it's impossible to really compare the different activities that a tailor is performing to those of a pharmacist or an accountant or a miner. When we look at it quantitatively, all forms of abstract labor measured in the labor time can be compared to one another. And that's important because it's the work of different forms of labor that result in different commodities which will be exchanged for each other on the market. That's why we have to find a quantitative way to compare the labor that went into these products. Now, this concludes the first video. This concludes our attempt at understanding the first section of the book, the definition of commodities. Inshallah, we will try to make another video for next week in which we try to tackle the next section, which, if I'm not wrong, will be about the two different natures of labor, of work, and looking at economy and commodities really from the labor point of view. I hope that that you will really take some time to read the book. Buy a paper copy. There are really so many cheap editions in so many languages on the market, or just go to marxists.org and read it online. What I said is just a summary of the idea. I hope you try to enjoy it, and I promise if we get through these more dry economical analysis parts, that inshallah in a few weeks we will come to the more juicy part where we really dive into the history and nature of capitalism as a society, and maybe even start to understand what's wrong with capitalism, what the contradictions are that actually doom the system and makes it inevitable that it will at some point be replaced with a more efficient and more humane system. For now, I wish you all a very good day, a very good week. No matter what you're doing, I wish you much success. And of course, I wish you peace and blessings. And I hope to see you next time, inshallah.